Hello and welcome back to Knack Kitchen, where today we're making a chocolate Yule log. And this is my final Christmas offering to you for this year. And I'm so excited to share this recipe with you. It is absolutely delicious. It is a bit of a handful, but it's all going to be worth the effort. And without further ado, let's just get into this video and see how we make this amazing recipe. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll make our chocolate sponge. And for that, I have some eggs that I have separated over here, and the eggs are best separated when cold. We're going to let this come to room temperature and start with the whites. So with the egg whites, I am going to add a little bit of sugar, but before I add the sugar, we're just going to beat this until we reach medium soft peaks. So once we've reached soft peaks, we'll go ahead and add a little bit of the sugar at first, and we'll mix that properly as well. And we'll keep doing this until all of the sugar has been added, and eventually we'll have a stiff and glossy mixture. So just to check if our meringue is ready, we're going to invert this on our countertop, and since it did not fall, our meringue is ready. We're going to set this aside, and now we'll move over to the yolks. Now I'm not going to switch my beaters, I'm going to use the same ones, mostly because I'm lazy. But we're going to add some brown sugar this time. It gives a wonderful flavor, and we're going to beat this quite well. And when I say quite well, you'll see the color change dramatically. And as you can see, it's turned a lot paler. We'll reach something which is called the ribbon stage, and as you can see over here, when I try and make some ribbons on the batter, it stays for at least a couple of seconds, and that's what we want it to be. Now we'll add some melted butter, which you can even replace with some oil if you choose, and then we'll add some vanilla extract. I was almost at the end of that bottle, as you can see. And now I'm adding some coffee powder, and we're just going to mix this all together before we add our dry ingredients. So now we're just going to sieve in our dry ingredients, and I have some cocoa powder and a little bit of flour. We're not using any leavening agents. This sponge does not require any. And now we're just going to sieve this all through, and as you're noticing, the cocoa powder does always have clumps, so do use a spoon to pass it through your sieve. And now we're just going to beat this together until everything is combined. We do not want to overbeat at this point, so we'll just mix it until everything comes together. So now we're going to go ahead and add the egg whites, and we'll add a third at a time. And with the first third of your egg whites, you can mix it a little vigorously if you choose. You just want to loosen the batter. But from this point onwards, we are going to only fold in the egg whites because we want to keep in as much air as we possibly can. So once all of our egg whites have been incorporated, we're going to go ahead and transfer this batter onto our baking tray or cake pan, whichever we have. And depending on the size of your cake pan, you will have to adjust the recipe. I will mention the dimensions of my baking tray in the description box below. So now we're just going to coax the batter to the edges, and we want it to reach the edges so that it sticks to the edges, and we'll have a uniform cake. And the other thing which needs to be kept in mind is that you want to tap this on your countertop because we don't want any air bubbles in the batter. So now this goes into a preheated oven for about 10 minutes, and our cake is ready. We are going to just loosen it from the sides and let it cool for only 2 minutes. We need to roll up this cake right about now when the cake is still warm. So for that, I have some parchment paper, to which I'm going to add some cocoa powder and icing sugar. Now, I'm going to advise you to add a lot of cocoa powder and icing sugar because we do not want the cake to stick to the parchment paper. So be very generous with this, and if I'm being completely honest, this is my second batch of cake because the first cake did stick to the parchment paper and I learned my lesson. So now we are just going to remove the top layer of parchment paper from our cake, and once we've done that, we have to be very careful because the cake is very fragile. So be careful, do not rush this. We don't want the cake to tear completely or even slightly. The more perfect, the better. And now we're going to dust the top with some more icing sugar and cocoa powder because as much as we don't want the cake to stick to the parchment paper, we don't want it to stick to itself either. Now I'm just cutting off some of the excess parchment paper on the corner, and now we're going to roll this, and while you're rolling, we are going to roll this with the parchment paper inside. This is just going to help ensure that the shape stays intact, and it's just a little easier to roll the cake this way. And now once you have reached the end, we are just going to transfer this and let this cool at room temperature for at least 2 hours. And once it's cooled, then we'll move on to making our chocolate buttercream. And for that, I start with some sugar and some water because I'm making an Italian meringue buttercream and I absolutely love this recipe, and I'm sure you're going to love this too. Now, since a lot of people don't have a candy thermometer, I'm just going to show you how to eyeball this. So when your sugar syrup starts to come to a boil, that's when you start beating your egg whites. You don't have to worry, the egg whites will get cooked. So in case you're worrying about raw egg, that's not going to be an issue. And if you happen to have a candy thermometer, please do check out the description box below. I will mention the accurate temperatures. Now the sugar only boils for about 2 minutes. By then your egg whites would reach soft peaks, and then we'll just start adding the sugar syrup to the egg whites. Now a couple of things to be kept in mind here is that A, you add a little of the sugar syrup at first and beat that in properly. Why do we do that? Because the sugar syrup is way too hot. If you add too much, your egg whites will start to scramble. At the same time, if you add too much and you're not careful, you might end up burning yourself. So I'll advise that you add very little at a time, and then once your sugar syrup has cooled down a bit, then you can go ahead and add it in a steady stream. And now we're just going to beat this for at least 8 to 10 minutes. We want the egg whites to be at room temperature again. And that's when our Italian meringue would be ready. The way to test it is the same as always. We are going to invert the bowl, and since we did not end up with a mess, our Italian meringue is ready. We're going to go ahead and add the butter. And I'm using unsalted butter, and I guess you can use salted butter as well. You might have a little hint of salt, but then a lot of people seem to love chocolate and salt together, so by all means try that. Now coming to the tricky part of the recipe, you're going to notice that as you add the butter, your buttercream is basically going to turn into soup. And all I'm going to say over here is don't panic, have some faith, and as you keep beating the butter in, it will eventually start to come together. Now, I know it might be tough to think that way, particularly if you're making this the first time, because it does look like a complete mess and a disaster, but it will start to come together. Just have patience. And if I'm being completely honest, I've made this multiple times, but I still panic. But to help you out here, once you added all of the butter, we're going to go ahead and add some melted dark chocolate, and that's when the magic happens. In just about a couple of minutes, all of your worries are going to go away because you'll end up with the most amazing silky smooth buttercream. And one thing about the chocolate here is that I'm using orange flavored chocolate because I love chocolate and orange together, and I can promise you that if you like that combination, this is going to be the best buttercream of your life. But if you don't like chocolate and orange together, any dark chocolate will do. And as you can see, we have the most amazing buttercream here. And now if you are using this for cakes or frostings, you might want to refrigerate this first, but since we are using this as a filling, we can directly add this to our now cooled down cake. And now we're going to just unroll the cake, and I am going to crack this, and as you can see, there is a tear in this cake, but that's okay. It's going to end up being in the middle. It'll just get all hidden away, and you don't need to worry. You're just going to spread the buttercream out as evenly as you can. And then we're just going to roll this back up. And this time around, we'll not use the parchment paper. We'll just use it for support so that it does not stick to our hands. And this should be easy because your cake has that memory now because it has been sitting in that rolled up position for at least a couple of hours. And now we're just going to transfer this to any kind of flat surface and then put this in the refrigerator, ideally overnight, but for at least 3 hours. So at least about a couple of hours before serving, we're going to make our chocolate ganache, which is simply some dark chocolate and some warm cream. So to our dark chocolate, we'll add the cream, which has been simmering. Make sure you do not boil it because you don't want the cream to burn. And after letting it sit for about a couple of minutes, we're going to just whisk this, and initially it'll look like a complete mess, but it will come together and end up being beautifully smooth and glossy. So now that our ganache is ready, we are going to transfer this to the refrigerator for about half an hour to thicken up. So now that our ganache is set, we are going to set this aside and take the cake out. And just to get a more log-like look, I am going to cut a slight piece of cake from the edge, and it's a bit of a diagonal cut, and we're going to attach this to the side, which will make it look more like a log. But it's completely optional and you can skip that if you are more comfortable with the whole piece staying intact. So now we're just going to attach the cut piece of cake to the side with the help of some of our thick ganache, which is going to add a little amount and secure the piece on the side. So since the kitchen is a little too cold at this point, the ganache is firmed up a little too much, and I'm just microwaving the ganache for about 10 seconds. And now it's a lot looser, but it's perfect to glaze this whole cake. And now we're just going to add the ganache to the cake and cover it up entirely. And then I'm going to show you a very easy trick to get that whole wood-like look. So once the cake has been covered with the ganache, we're going to go ahead and use a fork to make some lines all across the surface, and that's how we end up with the wood-like look. There's really no way to mess this up because the more uneven your lines are, the more natural it's going to end up looking. And the last thing to be done is to set this in the refrigerator for one final hour, and our Yule log is ready. So here you have my recipe for the most amazing chocolate Yule log that is absolutely delicious, and it looks absolutely amazing as well. Now if you want to take the traditional route, then you can decorate this with some meringue mushrooms. I just happen to add a few chocolate roses, but this cake really needs nothing whatsoever. You can even give it a dusting of icing sugar if you want to go with the snowy look, but I did not want anything to cloud the amazingness of this log. Now I know this recipe is a bit of a handful, but trust me, it's going to be all worth the effort. If you did like this recipe, then please do give a like, share and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And as always, thank you so very much for watching, and I'm going to see you next week.